be in this pulpit on Sunday morning. A couple of things I might want to remind you of. Yesterday we celebrated, or at least recognized, the fact that it was the Feast of the Transfiguration. A day that sometimes seems to be overlooked in the church. It was, if you remember that occasion, when Jesus took Peter, James, and John up on the mountaintop where he was, shall we say, officially transformed from just being rabbi, teacher, to Son of God, and something very, very special in their lives. Today, being the 11th Sunday in Trinity, I want to speak to you about a couple of things. This story, this sermon is all about humility, which is, if I might say, is a rather disappearing trait in most of the world today. It's not the sort of thing that if you ask or talk to people about being humble, sometimes they don't really know what you're talking about. But I want to read to you two special sentences that came from today's lessons. First of all, in the epistle that Louis read to us earlier today from Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he said, "And last of all, he was seen also of me, for I am the least of the apostles." Paul is saying now, I am the least of the apostles. This man who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament characterizes himself as the least of the apostles because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. Then, of course, in the Gospel of St. Luke, and the publican standing afar off would not so much as lift up his eyes into heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, "God, be merciful unto me, for I am a sinner." Story about two young church members who were going door to door to invite people to visit their services one sunny Sunday afternoon. And when they knocked on one door, it was immediately clear that the woman who answered the door was not very happy to see them. She told them in no uncertain terms that she did not want to hear their message, and before they could say anything more, she slammed the door in their faces. To her surprise, however, the door did not close. In fact, it bounced back open. And so she tried again, really putting her back into it, and slammed it again with the same result. The door bounced back open. Convinced that these rude young people were sticking their foot in her door, she reared back to give it a slam that would teach them a lesson. And just then, one of them said quietly, "Ma'am, before you do that again, you really need to move your cat." You know, I imagine there's a certain amount of stubbornness in all of us. Sometimes it's because we really believe we're always right, and hence other people's opinions don't count, like the lady with the cat. And sometimes our false pride simply rears its ugly head and turns us into obnoxious blowhards that no one wants to be around. C.S. Lewis, the great Anglican writer and philosopher, called pride a spiritual cancer that eats up the very possibility of love and contentment and even common sense. Pride, he said, is a spiritual weakness that damages our souls, harms everyone in its path, and breaks God's heart. You know, the list of 7 deadly sins that was conceived by the early church many, many centuries ago, it was certainly no accident that pride was at the top of the list. And as to exactly that point, that kind of pride that Jesus is talking about in today's gospel lesson. In today's lesson, Jesus tells these Pharisees, who certainly thought that because of the things that they did, and that this particular Pharisee had conjured up this great impression of himself, and began to say, "Listen, I think thee that I'm not like this fellow over here. After all, I'm not an extortioner. I don't rob, I don't steal, I don't blackmail, I don't intimidate to get what I want." Furthermore, I don't run around with loose women. Well, I even go to church every week, fast often, and give 10% of everything I have. Know any people like that? And Lord, because of this, I'm head and shoulders above that publican over there. The poor publican, on the other hand, simply said, Lord, I'm just a sinner, and I ask for your mercy. I'm just a sinner. What a great and amazing statement about humility. Well, it's certainly not easy in the world in which we live today to be humble. You know, we're constantly bombarded by all kinds of media telling us that we deserve the very best just because of who we are. That we're more special than anyone else in the world because of the clothes we wear, the food we eat, or the beer we drink, or that humility sucks, that it's quite all right to beat our own drum so loudly that the rest of the world can't help but recognize us regardless of how vain we might be. And that we always need to be number one, regardless of the heavy price we have to pay to get there, or the countless souls we might injure in the process. I think that all of those kinds of things have resulted in a massive epidemic of false pride, believing that we are something or someone that we're not. And here's a sad fact that so many of us fail to realize. God really knows who we are. And so no matter how much we try to camouflage our real selves, He knows us far better than we know ourselves. This idea of becoming someone or something that we're not is simply wrong. Entertainers, athletes, and politicians have helped create a false aura of self-importance that is changing the way in which ordinary people view themselves. Do you know, I've found out something in my life? That those people who are really and truly great people are deep inside very humble people. I don't know if any of you watched the Hall of Fame celebration for the NFL last night. Without question, every one of those men who were inducted into the Hall of Fame gave credit to everyone but themselves. Their parents, their relatives, their friends, their coaches, their teammates. It was not an I thing. It's a we thing. Because it's the we that makes us truly great. And I truly believe that in the world in which we live today, there's probably no greater spiritual danger we face as God's people than that of false pride. Remember what the serpent said to Eve in the Garden of Eden? Here, just eat of this forbidden fruit, and guess what? You're going to be just like God. Not so. Pride, you see, once again played a vital part in the original sin and fall of Adam and Eve. Bishop Fulton Sheen once said, "Pride is the king of all vices. It is the first of the pallbearers of the soul." What a wonderful phrase that is. Other vices may destroy only their opposite virtues. In other words, as wantonness destroys chastity, as greed destroys temperance, as anger destroys gentleness, pride, Bishop Sheen said, destroys all. How do we go about avoiding the pitfalls of pride? Well, I think there's several things that we ought to think about. I think, first of all, we have to learn to be honest with our Lord and Maker. And that simply means we have to confess and repent. And that ought to be pretty obvious from the parable that Jesus used in today's gospel lesson. You see, the publican got it right. It was a simple statement from a simple man. And if he understood that simple principle, I'm just a sinner, so can anyone else who's willing to do that. So when we confess, we have to make sure that we are completely cleansed. We have to pray to God that He will rid us of all our sins. And here's the important part, both known and unknown. You know, pride sometimes hides itself deep within us. We may not know about it. But in addition to all of the bad things that we know about ourselves, we ought to ask God to cleanse us of any kind of pride that dwells within us. Sometimes a pridefulness that we're not aware of or willing to believe about ourselves. David wrote in the 19th Psalm, he said, Lord, cleanse me from my secret faults. And believe me, we all have our secret faults. Pride is often an unseen danger in our Christian walk. It's somewhat like an iceberg. You know, the most dangerous part of it lies beneath the surface. Generally speaking, we alone do not have the power, the knowledge, or the self-will to cure ourselves. And so we have to level with God and let Him provide the remedy. Then I think we have to learn not to take ourselves too seriously. You know, so many people in the world today are so hung up on themselves that they fail to see all of the rich diversity that surrounds them. One of the great actors of our time, Paul Newman, once pictured his own epitaph as reading, "Here lies Paul Newman, who died a failure because his eyes turned brown." Remember old blue eyes? Paul Newman may have been one of the greatest actors of all time, but to hear Newman speak, you would never have known. Despite his iconic status, Newman always credited his ability to laugh at himself and his reluctance to not take himself too seriously. That Pharisee that Jesus spoke about obviously thought a great deal of himself. He was absolutely impressed with the kind of fellow he was. Listen to what St. Paul tells us in the 12th chapter of Romans. "For I say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith." In other words, we're not supposed to think too highly of ourselves. And when we want to compare ourselves, we ought to compare ourselves upwards, not downwards. The Pharisee compared himself to a lowly publican by demeaning the man and by considering this publican to be on a lower level than himself. Paul also advises in the 2nd chapter of Philippians that we are to consider others better than ourselves. And of course, above all else, the best way to resist the temptation of false pride is to remain humble. Jesus Christ is the greatest example of humility the world has ever known. He took the form of a servant, even to the point of washing his disciples' feet, trying to get us to understand that servants are not above their master. And when thinking about humility, let me ask you this morning to consider something rather humorous. That's the difference between dogs and cats. You see, the master pets the dog, and the dog wags his tail and thinks, he must be God. But when the master pets the cat purrs, and shuts his eyes, and thinks to himself, I must be God. And though Jesus in his grace reached down to us, I think unfortunately there's still a perverse human tendency to think sometimes like the cat. You know, it's very easy to get up and get caught up in frightful thinking about oneself. Of course, we all want to feel good about ourselves and who we are, but not to the extent of letting our pride give us false impressions of who we really are. The publican really never considered that. He simply said, Lord, I'm a sinner, and I ask for your mercy. You know, in ancient Greece, one of the worst sins you could commit was that of hubris, excessive form of pride that's also known as arrogance. The most serious form of it was when you thought you were the equal of or better than the gods. And there are many stories in Greek mythology about mortals whose hubris caused the gods to slap them down. This translated socially into the very real danger of being slapped down hard by those who represented the gods, such as priests, kings, government officials, if you dared to think that you were their equal, or especially if you thought you were better than them. Which is, you see, in the final analysis, a truly humble person has no need for others to know how humble he or she feels, nor any fear of others knowing. It's just not that important. A truly humble person feels neither superior or inferior to anyone else. Because you see, true pride and true humility are exactly the same thing. All of us are sinful people. And as the publican, we must never fail to own up to our shortcomings. There's no place in God's house for self-righteous hypocrites. I've been in churches where that's far too prevalent. I recently saw this on Facebook from an organization called Christ Effect that said this. It said, I would rather attend church with messed up people who are seeking after God than with religious people who think they're enforcers. Listen, we're all messed up to one degree or another. True believers understand that and simply